Namaskar, this is Akhilesh Bhargav. Welcome to Tidbits on Business and Finance with me. It has been 30 years since India initiated path-breaking liberalization reforms to unshackle its economy in 1991. It coincided with India pledging its goal with Bank of England for a loan of a mere $400 million and another bailout loan of $2 billion from the IMF that came with attendant conditions which actually triggered those reforms. A lot has happened in India for the better in the past 30 years, which, as the Economic Times points out, has been on many fronts. India's per capita income has increased from $360 in 1991 to $2,100 now. India now is a member of the G20, the global club of the top nations, as against it being a member of the G77 in 1991, which is the club of the world's poor nations. About 270 million Indians during this period have been lifted out of poverty. India has now become a net food exporter even in times of droughts. The Indian economy grew at an average of 7% per year between 1991 to 2016, as against the pre-1991 average growth rate of 3.5%, that sarcastic Hindu growth rate that used to be called. And because of that, India's GDP in the last 30 years has multiplied by 9 times. The Indian economy managed to free itself out of the suffocating license raj to finally become an open consumer economy. According to political historians, the true architect of the 1991 economic reforms was our late Prime Minister Shri P.V. Narasimha Rao and not his then Finance Minister Shri Manmohan Singh, who is widely credited with it. After all, it is the Prime Minister who takes the final shots and the final call in such kind of policy matters, and unless he had not permitted it, they would not have taken place. The Congress party too takes credit for the reforms, even though it was the one that was directly responsible for decades of misplaced socialism that had stifled India's economic growth and had brought its economy to its knees in 1991. With the Indian economy being crisis-ridden now, primarily due to poor economic policies under the Modi regime since 2015, the Congress recently issued a statement on these 3 decades of the 1991 reforms. The statement issued by the Congress has prudent advice for the Modi government from Shri Manmohan Singh. He says in that statement that the economic liberalization process in 1991 was triggered by an economic crisis that confronted our nation then. He says that the edifice of India's economic reforms was built on the desire to prosper, the belief in our capabilities, and the confidence to relinquish control of the economy by the government. Dr. Singh then says that successive governments over the past 3 decades have followed this path to catapult India to a $3 trillion economy and into the league of the world's largest economies. During this period, he also says that 300 million persons have been lifted out of poverty and jobs have been provided to the youth. He further says that the reform process unleashed the spirit of free enterprise, which has helped reduce some world-class companies in India and has helped India to emerge as a global power in many sectors. He says that he has been deeply saddened at the devastation caused by the COVID pandemic and the loss of lives of millions of fellow Indians. Too many lives have been lost, which he says should not have been. The social sectors of health and education, Dr. Singh says, have lagged behind and have not kept pace with our economic progress. He says that the road ahead is even more daunting than the 1991 crisis and that the nation needs to recalibrate its priorities to ensure dignified living for its people. According to Dr. Singh, it is not time to rejoice and exult, but to introspect and ponder. And while in 1991 reforms he had quoted Victor Hugo to say that no power on earth can stop an idea whose time has come, he now quotes Robert Frost to say that I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, in order to indicate the huge challenges, the huge unfinished agenda that the Indian economy faces today. According to us, Sri Manmohan Singh is right when he says that it is time to introspect and ponder today. After all, we face multiple crises in our economy, many of which could have been avoided had the Modi government's economic policies not been inappropriate and disastrous as they have been on many fronts. When you look at the various economic parameters and problems that we face today, it is apparent that however much a rosy picture the government ministers and sycophants may paint, the government policies are just not delivering what they ought to or what they have claimed to. Something has certainly gone terribly wrong in the matter of formulation of economic policies and their execution under the Modi government. When you look at the widespread closures and downsizing in the informal and MSME sector, when you look at the rising and untamed joblessness, when you see the languishing investments in new projects, when you see the burgeoning NPAs, bankrupt banks and borrowers, when we see the rising defaults, shrinking middle class, eroded household savings, depleted government treasury, poor GDP growth, rising inflation, growing inequality, and the poverty that is going up, and also the plummeting confidence of the corporates and the consumers, which is today at an all-time low. When we see at all these parameters, then they all go to show that the government policies are just not working, and we are now perhaps in need of another round of 1991-like landmark reforms. What we need is introspection and action on a lot of fronts in order to revive the economy and arrest its downslide. We need to do that in order to ensure that we realize the potential of the Indian economy. The primary challenges that plague the Indian economy and have suffocated growth, for which yet another round of landmark reforms are needed, include many items. Let us discuss them today. The first issue, due to factors like poor infrastructure or the sheer absence of adequate infrastructure, the high cost of funds, the ever-increasing costs of compliance and rampant corruption, the cost and contingency of doing business in India is very high. Indian producers are thus not able to compete globally due to this factor. The flagship PLI scheme of the government itself recognizes this reality and therefore seeks to compensate manufacturers for this high cost of doing business in India as compared to other competing nations. The PLI kind of schemes are a mere short-term steroid and are not a long-term solution to bring down the cost of doing business in India. And this is the first issue where we need reforms in India, bring down the cost of doing business in the country. The second point where we need reforms relates to India as a heavily regulated nation with multiple and overlapping laws in every domain of economic activity. Due to this, there has been a huge upsurge in red tapeism, unwanted government interference in business has shot up, corruption and the costs of compliance have gone up, and because of this, few businesses are able to sustain their operations. The government promised us minimum government and maximum governance, but what we have got so far is the very opposite of it. We've got a maximum government and minimum governance. It suffocates the freedom of doing business, particularly for the small ones, and that explains why the much needed investments in new projects today are at a multi-decade low. The government needs to do away with the multiple filing of returns under various laws and replace it with one single and simple annual return, at least for the small and unorganized entities. And that's where we need reforms. The third area is to do with India's slow-moving, uncertain and expensive judicial system, which makes enforcing contracts and rights a nightmare. The judiciary has increasingly become inaccessible to the MSME sector, which needs its support and protection the most. The judiciary is actually meant for the lowest segment of the business category, but that's not been happening. That also reflects in the rising inequalities in the economy, where the big corporates have only grown bigger and the smaller ones are collapsing and vanishing, and no support comes from the judiciary to protect their rights and contracts. We need reforms there. Increasing digitization in compliance is needed, but it has got along with it harsh system-driven penalties and prosecution in India, even for unintentional violations. With more and more data in hand, the corporates are now under constant government surveillance, which is needed according to us only for the tax evaders and violators, who are actually an exception and not the rule. But today, all of us face it. Because of that, notices come from departments. A notice from a government department in its customary intimidating language erodes entrepreneur confidence in the ease of doing business in India, in the safety of his capital, and often results in business closures. We need reforms here. The banking sector crisis has not been reformed and rectified despite measures like bank mergers, insolvency and bankruptcy code, the PCA regime, restructuring and widespread bank recapitalization. It is the banks that provide the fuel to energize and drive the economy, and that's been missing today. We again need reforms here. And finally, the system today is rife with a new bunch of cronies who seem to take it all. Reforms are needed to prevent unworthy and ineligible cronies from monopolizing and cornering the goodies that the system has on offer. Major regulations are needed here to prevent cronies from abusing the system. The very fact that business and consumer confidence is at an all-time low speaks it all and debunks the self-congratulatory claims of the government that all is good on the economic front. The ecosystem today just does not inspire confidence. It is time that the investors and the consumer come back to invest and to spend. And for that, what we need is a genuine set of reforms which significantly improve the ground reality, which improve the ease of doing business and which reduce the cost of doing business. And these are needed in order to improve the entire environment such that the economy starts gaining momentum as against the present scenario where it has been languishing. It is time we have a set of genuine reforms, and that will turn the economy for the better. This is Akhilesh Bhargav signing off till we meet again. Namaskar.
Now be the first to know about the latest updates on our new news app. Go on your Android or iOS, search for HW News Network. Download our app, choose the language you prefer to get updates in, and be up to date with the latest news.
If you like this video, please share it, and we would love to hear your comments in the comments section down here. Also, please do like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter to get minute-to-minute news updates. For more such shows and videos, subscribe to our YouTube channel.